Thank you, Brother Said. That was quite interesting and informative, which also brings me to the next speaker. Mr. Said also mentioned something during his conversation with you and talk today. Throughout the world and also here in Australia, through the media, we have seen a sense of Islamophobia developing due to misconceptions and misunderstanding around certain issues, which we probably are all familiar with, and people that reside in Australia through the media probably have faced this a lot of time. You may have people come up at you and ask certain questions that sometimes you might feel that they're just being ignorant, but there is a sense of misunderstanding. Ms. Hanifa Deen is an award-winning author who writes narrative non-fiction. Mrs. Deen has also won the New South Wales Premier's Literacy Award and has been shortlisted for many other awards for her outstanding work. Ms. Hanifa Deen has also served as the Hearing Commissioner, Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission of Australia, and also on the Board of Directors for SBS, Special Broadcasting Services. She was the Director of Community Education at the Victorian Ethnic Affairs Commission, as well as the Deputy Commissioner at the Multicultural Affairs Commission, WA. Currently, she is the Chair of the Institute of Cultural Diversity and is also the editor of Sultana's Dream, an online magazine written and produced by Australian Muslim women, which she founded in 2011. I would like you to warmly welcome, and I'd like to invite Mrs. Hanifa Deen on stage. Her topic today will be From Indifference, Australian Muslim Response regarding Islamophobia.
Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me down the back? Thank you for raising your hand down there. I also would like to thank the traditional owners, past and present, of this land on which we are meeting today. My paper is From Indifference to Islamophobia, looking at how Australian Muslims have responded. 25 years ago, anti-Islamic prejudice did not occupy public space. Mainstream Australians were largely indifferent towards Muslims. Voices of prejudice spoke mostly in whispers. In general, the Australian media was uninvolved. There was little empathy, but there was little hostility. 25 years ago, Muslims across Australia built mosques and schools with less trouble from local councillors. Muslim women wore hijabs in public, for the most part, without harassment. The word Islamophobia was not in popular usage. Non-Muslims knew little about Muslims, and mosque communities seemed happy to maintain that social distance. However, since 9/11, and more recently the advent of international terrorist groups claiming to act on behalf of Islam, the climate of opinion has changed radically. Casual racism has mutated into an ugly form of Islamophobia, disturbingly played out in the media, the streets, and the shopping malls. Today, religion has become a surrogate for racism. Muslims, especially young men, are tarred with the un-Australian label and viewed with suspicion bordering on alarm. When I listened to earlier speakers, at first I wondered how my topic related to the conference theme. But then I realised that what I'm talking about is the current social climate in which halal products, halal slaughtering industry, Muslim businessmen and businesswomen have to circulate, something Muslims are facing daily. Some Muslims respond by defensively circling the wagons, retreating into a closed community. On the other hand, there is a proactive response by first and second generations, Australian-born Muslims, who are learning how to live as a minority and claim their rights as Australian citizens. Muslim women in particular are active in speaking out. These 21st century activists engage with the wider community face-to-face and through social media, actively seek interfaith and secular alliances and recognise the benefits of Australian law. I think this conference today is a good example of what I mean. The indifference I mentioned earlier has disappeared, and we all know why. The previous speaker showed us the appalling images. What have we replaced by? It's replaced by a hard, uncompromising scrutiny from politicians, the public, and media. Now in 2016, the voices of prejudice are drawn from a wider spectrum. Hardly a day goes by without Islam, Muslims, the word terrorism occupying media space. Groups promoting Islamophobia, they thrive on social media. My grandfathers, both of them, Punjabi on one side, Kashmiri on the other, came here in the 1890s. My maths tells me that's about 126 years ago. So I call myself a dinosaur. And as a historian, I've observed the entry of Muslims into Australia over many, many decades. The first generation Muslims immigrated here in the 60s and 70s. They prioritised building mosques and schools and started organising businesses that have flourished and grown today, such as the Halal slaughtering industry. They were the leaders the government talked to. At very first, in the 60s, we compared to the USA and to the United Kingdom, we lacked an intellectual base. That has dramatically changed in the late 20th century, and now in the 21st, we have Australian Muslims who've joined the ranks of lawyers, doctors, journalists, documentary makers, artists, architects, business managers. Like all other immigrants, Australians, their parents invested in their children's futures. Muslims around Australia have usually been defined through what happens here in Sydney. Now, I call that the Sydney prism. And the early gatekeepers liaising with government and the media were mainly the overseas-born mosque and Islamic society leaders. The focus of attention by the media was, I remember when I visited here many years ago, Lakemba Mosque. This perception that all Muslims acted the same was a form of self-stereotyping, I believe, and we Muslims kept quiet about this. To the government, Islam was a religion, and religions must have clergy who speak for their followers. So the thinking went. Overlooked was the enormous influence that ethnic societies have. Turkish, Lebanese, Pakistani, Malaysian, Bosnian, Albanian, and so sometimes seen as purely cultural, or now and then referred to as low-intensity Muslims. Today, they play a strong part in showing non-Muslim Australians the social and festive face of Muslims. Let's look at more changes. Leadership and representation. First-generation older leaders continue to lead Islamic societies, but a younger generation is using other platforms, other forums to be heard. They're visible, they have their blogs. I think someone used the term cool Muslims. They're carving out their own domains. Their English fluency, their energy and sense of humour is out there, breaking down barriers and stereotypes. They are more comfortably integrated. Now, instead of being research subjects, instead of being put under the microscope and looked at, Muslim graduates and senior lecturers do research about their own communities. I didn't want to be studied and written about, so I picked up a typewriter and I started writing about myself and about Muslims that I knew. So today, younger Muslims make their own documentaries about Islam in Australia. They've learnt the strategies of living as a minority, remembering that their parents came from societies where they were the majority. And when you enter Australia and you come from a society where you've been the majority, it takes a while to learn strategies that minorities have to use. Asserting a positive image in difficult times, it's an ongoing struggle. Identity becomes a powder keg. How hard it is for Muslim parents to explain to their children when they come home crying from school that they are Australian. One mother said to me, How do we explain to our children that we are not evil? You are constantly expected to demonstrate your loyalty publicly and repeatedly denouncing acts of terrorism. Spokespeople are caught on the back foot trying to explain themselves, not only locally, but in relation to trouble spots around the world, as if they are in some way responsible for these events. A crime committed by an individual or a group is seen as our crime, and images, as we know, are stronger than words. An identity needs sources of self-respect. Minority groups often have to scramble at the beginning for self-respect. Migrant groups, whether Jews, Vietnamese, Italians and Greeks in the early days, went through the same. 20 years ago, the young men I spoke to, saw no reflections of themselves in popular culture. I remember they were grasping at straws. They idolized Muhammad Ali or Malcolm X. Today, too often, the sit up and take notice of me images are rampaging jihadist murderers who seek to recruit alienated youth worldwide. In Australia, their appeal is limited. We are a healthy, multicultural society, but we can't take it for granted. Today, young men are under scrutiny as never before, automatically viewed as the potential enemy within. But I repeat, look at the overwhelming majority who claim their place as equals. Those with a more open mindset, living an adaptable, hybrid life. They understand Australian culture. Do you remember when Salam Cafe first appeared on television? What a refreshing show that was. We now have handfuls of young Muslim comedians who go around, who laugh at themselves and laugh at the audience. Laughing is a great way of breaking down barriers. We've got musicians. We've got Waleed Ali, who made a breakthrough on television there. We have the Islamic Museum of Australia. And I know that maybe some of our overseas visitors don't know, but sometimes there's a little bit of competition between Melbourne and Sydney. So when I say to Sydney Muslims, have you dropped into the Islamic Museum? They say, oh no, not yet. Well, as an earlier speaker said, it's remarkable. It's well worth a visit. So what I'm talking about are the people I call the 21st century activists who engage with the wider community face-to-face and through social media, at which I'm hopelessly incompetent. They actively seek interfaith and secular alliances and recognise the benefits of Australian law. We see them on TV, we read their books and their articles. And what about women leaders? Hijabis and non-hijabis work together. Muslim women speak out through many different forums, on TV, media, conferences, and they are major agents in reducing social distance. And they liaise and they work outside very hard, and I think most men presidents of Islamic organisations realise who's doing a lot of the background work as well and who supports them from the heart. As another project I should mention that our overseas visitors may not be aware of, it's called the Islamophobia Register. That's a unique project that was started by a female Muslim lawyer in 2014 in response to the growing anecdotal evidence suggesting a rise in incidents of Islamophobia. The Islamophobia Register Australia, as it's called, was the first of its kind in Australia to provide a platform for incidents of Islamophobia to be reported, recorded and analysed. Other initiatives include the training of overseas imams and our wonderful university-based Islamic centres that we've had in most states. All of them have worked together. I think we all work together, reducing social distance, taking the initiative and refusing to accept victimisation. I love the example of the leadership of mosque communities who opened the doors to non-Muslims. That's an example of reducing social distance, showing the beautiful serenity, that still beauty that is inside mosques. But social distance, here's an example of how deep this problem is. About 2 years ago, I was at a symposium in Canberra. Now, there were 300 Muslims, most of them, about 280 of them, were non-Muslims who had never come, I'd say, within 5 paces of a Muslim. And there were about 30 of us Muslims there too, having a very open and frank exchange. After 2 days of interaction, I remember 2 women walked up to me. I was sitting round a table having a cup of tea and laughing with some of my Muslim friends that I didn't catch up with from interstate. One of the women said to me, "I didn't know Muslims laughed. I didn't know they told jokes." It's funny, but it sent a chill down my spine. It's chilling, isn't it? And I think we need to break these views down. I spoke 2 years ago to a West Australian journalist who asked 14 of his colleagues if any of them knew any Muslims. The answer was no. No contact at a personal level at all. Now, Muslims have friends, many friends in the interfaith movement in Australia, but I also believe there's a need to return to what I call secular alliances. Hate speech needs combating by religious people and irreligious skeptics who should put aside their ideological differences in the interests of social justice and human rights. A recent meeting between Prime Minister Turnbull and the Islamic Council of Victoria echoed similar sentiments. Prime Minister Turnbull's language and media statements are certainly far different to his predecessors. He displayed an open-mindedness and an acceptance. Let's look for a minute at legal responses. Using religious hate speech laws is another strategy favoured by some Muslims, but not all Muslims. I believe that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. So, legislation with community education can break the cycle of abuse, just as sexual discrimination laws did many years ago when they were introduced in Australia. As I say, laws might not change attitudes, but they modify behaviour. In 2003 in Melbourne, 3 new Muslims filed a complaint under the State's Freedom from Religious Vilification Act. The Islamic Council of Victoria took a Christian fundamentalist group to court. I wrote a book about that called the Jihad Seminar. I think we have to accept that attitudinal change takes decades. And during these years, we need these alliances, we need the law, we need community education, and, God willing, some changes in Middle East politics. Muslims today are not shirking their rights as Australian citizens to speak out and show non-Muslims the beauty of Islam. Muslims have opinions about what is happening overseas in the Middle East and in Turkey. They cannot disengage with the suffering of other Muslims overseas. Yet they are often expected or supposed to gag themselves because these views are not held to be legitimate, which is strange in a democracy. Australian Muslims have an empathy with tragedies worldwide, and that goes outside of Western Europe as well. Many years ago in Sydney, I came across a remarkable man who said something to me that I have never forgotten. And this is what non-Muslims need, I believe, to move closer to. It was the understanding of my Halal butcher. I met him when I was writing my first book, Caravanserai. He had an empathy born of experience. And this is what he said. You need a heart big enough to love 2 countries if you are an immigrant. It shouldn't be a case of loving one over the other. It's like having two children. Your heart must be big enough to love them both. Thank you. Yes, certainly.
Thank you very much, Sister Hanifa Deen, for that insightful presentation and speech. I think it's important to hear the issues that are present today in Australia, and it's important to also focus on some of the positivity that's happening. For example, today is one instance that that can be brought out, that can bring the good in people and bring people together and unite. So, is there any question in the audience?
So, I'd like to share with this with your opinion on that. When we work in the media, and I'm referring to, obviously, as a journalist, you don't have boundaries about religion or faith. You work in the interest of the people indiscriminately. Now, but if I ask you, what do you think about, in today's scenario, the responsibility of the media outlets and journalists who have Muslim background to work in the media to reduce these misconceptions and all these stereotyping things?
So you're asking me, what is the responsibility of Muslims who work in the media?
Yeah.
I don't believe in self-censorship. I'm against censorship, basically. I think it's very hard for journalists working in the media because the media rushes for headlines and it wants trouble. It's looking for the incident. Now, I think I was talking to you earlier and you told me about what happened in Melbourne. One small little group, 10 people, 20 at the most, at one edge confronting another group, let's say the anti-Muslim group, holding up their slogans. A small group of well-meaning non-Muslims confront them. They have reasons, sympathy reasons, but also they want to raise their image. And what you have is the wonderful thing that was happening, attended by 10,000 plus people, I think you mentioned, was not reported on. The clash was reported on. Well, I believe that you rectified that. Am I right?
Yeah.
You did. Would you like, perhaps, would you like to tell people how you rectified it? Because I can only applaud that. It was an excellent way of handling a situation.
Actually, I acted as an event manager, but there was some my response mixed with my journalistic work as well. And what I feel actually, with a fairly more focused on the outcome of the event, rather than what happened outside, which is beyond the agenda of the event.
Exactly, you've put that quite succinctly, and yeah, on what it was about, not the fringe little thing. Yeah. Is there a question?
But rather a comment. My name is Muhammad Ali, and I'm from Canberra. I had Forum Australia, as I said earlier in the morning, and I'm all what I should say that the work, as far as the diversity work, is going on in Canberra also. I just wanted to share with the audience over here. And I'm so thankful to you and Ateek that you have been always speaking about these stereotypes. Dan Abdul Rahman is a wonderful force in Canberra, and I have been also diversity champion for 2015 from ACT Human Rights Commission, and also volunteer of the Multicultural. What I'm trying to say is that I'm often on ABC radio over there, 666 radio. It's always hard to defend yourself, and some of the times people just take it in very different context. But I believe that in all honesty, this journey should continue, because after a long 10 years of Forum Australia now, things have started coming up in the shape which we want to see. And my commendation to all of the people who are here who have been fighting, right, and to you especially, Hanifa, and to Ateek. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And might I just thank the organisers of this marvellous day, all the hard work they've done, and thank you for your invitation.